Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bill Schaffner. On behalf of CME Outfitters, I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining us for episode 1 of a 3-part CMEOCast series on best practices for implementing a shingles protocol in your practice setting. Today's episode is titled, Implementing a Shingles Protocol in Primary Care Settings. This activity is brought to you by CME Outfitters, an award-winning accredited provider of continuing education for clinicians worldwide. As I mentioned, I'm William Schaffner. I'm a professor of preventive medicine and infectious diseases at the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague and friend, Dr. Iris Gorfinkel. Iris is a family physician and is the founder and principal investigator of Prime Health Clinical Research in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Welcome, Iris.
Thank you, Bill.
To frame today's episode, let's start by reviewing our learning objective, which is to develop best practices to implement a shingles protocol in the primary care setting. So, Iris, let's begin our discussion with shingles by the numbers and why primary care clinicians need to take action to improve vaccination uptake.
You know, it's actually pretty astounding the number of people in any given year who will experience shingles. The number is not in the thousands. It's actually 1 million people a year who will get this. So I think, as any clinician will know from their own practice, this is a common disease. The lifetime risk is actually 1 in 3. So if you look at the burden of illness, it's tremendous. And never mind, 10% of those individuals will go on to develop postherpetic neuralgia. And there's actually, it's small, but it's measurable, a percent that gets hospitalized from it.
Let's look at some ethnic differences in shingles occurrence, which are somewhat surprising, actually.
They are surprising. And I think one of the biggest surprises of this is that it doesn't obey the usual rules of the social determinants of health. So normally, if someone is a Black American, what do we see? Higher rates of everything. But in shingles, it's a notable exception. For whatever reason, Black Americans have much lower rates. In fact, that rate is what is quoted here, 19% of Blacks versus 42% of whites. It's half of that of whites. And Latino populations and Asian populations also have less disease. But not to lose sight of the fact that still 1 in 3 vaccine eligible adults over the age of 60 have been vaccinated, which is a travesty. This is a preventable disease through vaccination.
So, Iris, we all know that shingles is a rash, but it's more than a rash, isn't it? So talk to us a little bit about the various organ systems that are impacted by shingles.
It's actually not completely understood why this happens, but the chickenpox virus can stay dormant in the dorsal ganglion, and it can stay dormant for many, many years. One of the factors thought to trigger an episode of shingles is something called immunosenescence. And what that depressing term means is that as we get older, the virus may reactivate to travel down a specific nerve root, infect and damage that nerve, and then cause a rash. So really the rash is just the final aspect. It's kind of like the flower, and you've got the stem and you've got the root. And here are some complications seen in this slide. You can take a look. People have heard that there are ocular complications, the most common of which is actually iritis, but keratitis can happen. Rarely, less than 1%, encephalitis can happen. There can be meningitis. Again, fortunately, these are rare. Paralysis of the diaphragm can happen. Again, a very rare complication. And they list a couple of other things here as well. But the most common thing we're going to see is, of course, the rash, and then in 10%, the postherpetic neuralgia.
So Iris, let's bring this back to practice. What risk factors can help primary care clinicians identify vaccine eligible patients?
You know, it's an interesting question, Bill. The older the patient, the sicker they get. And I think that's the key here. A lot of the time we see somebody who's older, who's frail, and we might think, we better be careful with vaccines. This is the opposite of that, because these are the individuals who, in fact, are at the greatest risk. So what do we see? As the patient gets older, we see a higher likelihood that they will get shingles with every passing decade after the age of 50, especially. It's especially common in the frail. It's common with those who have comorbidities. They're already fighting other battles and enter shingles. So we mentioned the 1 in 3 lifetime risk, but by the time a person is 85, the risk jumps to 50%. The standard of care is to vaccinate these frail individuals to ensure that they do not get that. The most common reason is, in fact, a decline in cell-mediated immunity because of this depressing thing called immunosenescence. But we see it also in other individuals. They don't necessarily have to be old to have immunosenescence or immunosuppression, as we well know. Cell-mediated immunosuppressive disorders, hematological malignancies, drugs can do this, and HIV, take note, it is not a small difference. We are talking a 15-fold increase. So these individuals are at great risk of getting the disease, and it is precisely this population that we want to be sure to target. It's got a bit of a gender bias. There's an increased risk in females. That's actually interesting. Bill, I don't know if you've heard, like COVID-19 actually it seems to be protective to be female.
Right, exactly. So this is just a paradox.
It's just the opposite of that.
Exactly. Now, Iris, you've nicely defined the patients who need to be vaccinated. Let's talk a little bit about the vaccines. Tell us about the FDA-approved vaccines that are available.
There's 2 vaccinations on the market. One is the older vaccination called ZVL, and I'm just going to say the name briefly because after this I will be referring to it as ZVL. That's Zostavax. The newer vaccination is RZV, that's Shingrix. The biggest difference between the two, of course, is that the older one is a live attenuated viral vaccination. In other words, it cannot be given to individuals who are immunosuppressed. It is also given as a subcutaneous vaccination. And what's fascinating about that is that it made it to market first. And what do we see? It was actually less efficacious. And there's not a small difference here. If you take a look, just cast your eyes down the number. So here, shown in red is RZV, shown in green is ZVL. So if you just quickly cast your eyes down the number, you get the sense. RZV has 97% efficacy, practically across the board. And what does that mean? We're taking a disease in which the lifetime risk is 1 in 3, and we're transforming that into a rare event. That's what it means. It's the difference between getting the disease and not getting the disease. And that's in contrast to the older ZVL. With ZVL, we see lesser immunity and we see a loss of that immunity over time. So those are the differences in the vaccinations. Bill?
The difference is really very, very impressive in preventing shingles itself and postherpetic neuralgia. So tell us a little bit more about that and some of the other secondary benefits of getting vaccinated.
One of the fascinating things about postherpetic neuralgia is that in the original trials, that, by the way, involved 30,000 individuals over many different countries. This was a huge effort. The Zoe 50 and 70 trials took 4 years to complete. Think about that in the context of warp-sped vaccination trials happening in the COVID realm. It's important to understand this is a model of how vaccination trials should be run. Randomized placebo-controlled trials running for 4 years, looking not only at serological response, but also looking at the number of diseases, the number of cases. And what we saw in the data was extremely exciting. It was actually world-changing. A 97% reduction in disease that seemed to have durable immunity as the data carries on. The one thing about postherpetic neuralgia is that there were so few cases, it was actually hard to count how many cases of postherpetic neuralgia there actually was. There were that few. But what we could see looked like a very positive signal. The amount of postherpetic neuralgia was much less.
So primary care providers such as yourself are on the front line. So as you talk to patients about shingles vaccine, are they really aware of it before you begin this conversation?
You know, it's an interesting thing. If we go to the next slide, we can take a look. There is a large awareness of that. I still remember when we were bringing patients into the trial, that was actually one of the big challenges we faced. Patients weren't aware of what shingles meant, of herpes zoster. When we talked about it, we could easily trigger a memory of this person or that person, but they didn't have a name. But now patients are widely educated about it, largely because of the advertising campaigns that have been done on television. And so they're aware of it. And what's interesting is that in practically all of the OECD countries at this point, Bill, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it has become the standard of care for individuals over 50 to be offered that vaccination.
For sure. So the relationship between the patient's perceptions about the side effects of the vaccine and low vaccine uptake. You know, initially there was a great surge of people who wanted to get vaccinated. Now this has quieted down a little bit. We're going to have to promote vaccination a little bit more with the patients who have not yet been vaccinated.
I think it's a critical point that you bring up. And what's interesting when we discuss it, there's two aspects to that. One, defining what the standard of care is for a doctor. I'm here to provide you with the vaccinations you need. And I think that for many individuals, that is the expectation. I think that when we produce it as, you know, what do you think about this whole vaccine thing? Like, yeah, I know you're laughing, but that's actually the way some doctors will present that. And the problem with that is that you're taking the onus of knowledge and you're saying to the patient, you now have the onus of knowledge. I don't have that onus anymore. It becomes yours. And patients are not always in a position to have the same knowledge that a physician does.
Absolutely. So this leads to missing opportunities in practice to vaccinate. So what are some of the key opportunities that are missed in primary care settings?
I think basically when we're having a visit for a patient, it depends on your electronic health record or if you're working with a paper thing. I think in the back of our own minds, we always have to consider, have we addressed vaccinations? Vaccinations are relatively low-lying fruit. And what's interesting is that patients can learn about them in one of two ways. Either they learn about them in the office or outside the office. When patients learn of them outside the office, it will trigger a natural question in their mind. Why was it not talked about in the office? Why did my doctor not bring it up? And you know, that hurts a little bit. It stings. It can potentially damage the relationship. So I think a proactive stance on vaccinations, even if that's just to say, I noticed you're missing vaccination XYZ. It could be against pneumonia. It could be against shingles, but addressing that is a key component. Even if we're to understand vaccine hesitancy, we must open the door to that conversation by addressing the need for vaccinations to begin with.
So Iris, you and I are in total agreement. There's still work to be done to increase vaccine uptake for shingles in primary care settings. So what other real-world strategies can you recommend to your colleagues who are doing primary care to implement a protocol for shingles vaccination in their practice?
One of my favorite things is opening up their chart and just saying, I just wanted to address vaccinations on this visit, or not. If I'm too busy with things that actually are really important at the time, I may say, let's set up an appointment to discuss your vaccinations, and let's work out a strategy here. Actually, strategies for the above 50 vaccinations does not take all that long. If you find that it takes a long time, a minimum standard would be to provide some printed information about what that vaccination schedule is. For the shingles vaccination, for RZV, the vaccine schedule is 0 time, and then anywhere from 8 weeks, 2 months, all the way out to 12 months. In the vaccination trials, we did 2 months. And I think that that's important to keep in mind. I like to keep the vaccines tight, 0 and 2 months, simply because that improves uptake. That improves the likelihood of a patient coming back. If you think, for example, to that last vaccination of Twinrix or a hepatitis B Engerix or whatever it is that you're giving, that vaccine is often forgotten. So the longer it's out there, the more likely it is to be forgotten. And more likely that patient is going to need a reminder call at the time. If we keep it tight, that is also a good practice.
So some practices can actually put in automated reminders of vaccinations. And are there some other tips that you can give?
I think the automated reminders is a wonderful way to go. And also having the nurse, if you're lucky to have a receptionist or a nurse who can just give that person a call the day before or even a week before their vaccination appointment is due. Because when vaccine appointments are booked, they're booked much in advance. Often we see patients forget about them. So ensuring that they get that extra call makes a big difference. And it makes them appreciate it too.
So Iris, thank you. Thank you for
Thank you.
providing us with a great discussion on best practices to implement a shingles protocol in the primary care setting. Now, let's close with key messages that we hope healthcare providers listening today will take away from this podcast. So let's wrap this up. We have to think about shingles. We have to think about immunizations. It's everyone really who is immunocompetent, older than 50 years of age. Think about it, do it now. Be insistent, don't be casual.
I'll add one quickie, which is it's not just the immunocompetent, it's the immunosuppressed who needs RZV as well, especially that patient population. Remember, HIV patients, 15 times the risk. Patients with autoimmune disease, much higher risk. Patients who are on immunosuppressants, including prednisone. Those patients have to be considered high-risk patients and should be vaccinated with RZV because when they get shingles, the likelihood of coming down with postherpetic neuralgia is much higher.
Well, this is dynamite. Thank you again, Iris. Terrific.
Thank you.
So everyone, to receive CME CE credit, click on the link identified here to complete the post-test and the evaluation online. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today for episode 1 of our 3-part CMEOCast series. To view additional episodes on best practices for implementing a shingles protocol in specialty care settings or in pharmacies, please visit CMEOutfitters.com. Thanks again for participating. Thank you for providing the best care for your patients. And please, everyone, stay safe and vaccinate.